Are all religions the same? Interesting question, right? Especially given that we live in some ways, an increasingly religious age. The last UK census showed that the number of different religions here in the UK is growing all the time. So we now don't just have Christians, we have Christians and Muslims and Buddhists and Hindus and Jews and Sikhs. So how do we navigate this world of diversity? One common answer I hear is people will sometimes say things like, well, perhaps we just need to affirm that in some way all the world's religions are essentially the same. That's a very common idea we hear. Problem is, it's a myth. It is, I'm afraid, total nonsense. It's a bit like, actually, if I was to say to you, did you know that actually all the world's booksellers are actually involved in a great big con? That you don't need to buy lots of books because every book in the world is actually essentially the same. And Amazon and Waterstones and whatever, they're trying to rip you off by conning you into thinking you need more than one book. I'm assuming your conclusion would not be, wow, what amazing wisdom. I'm assuming your conclusion would be, firstly, that's nuts. And secondly, you'd probably suspect I hadn't read more than one book. My claim of everything being the same actually is a claim of ignorance, not wisdom. And with the very greatest respect, when someone says to you the world's faith traditions are essentially the same, it's actually also a sign they haven't studied any of them particularly closely. Because when you look at the world's religions, when you compare Islam and Buddhism and Hinduism and Sikhism and Jainism, this goes on and on and on. Pick any that you like. And when you put to them questions like, what do they say that God is like? Do they say there's a God? What is God like? What do they say is the answer to questions like what it means to be human? Who are human beings? What do they say in answer to questions like what's gone wrong with the world and what's the solution? When you put those four questions, what is God like? Who are we? What's gone wrong? What's the solution to the world's major faith traditions? You see huge differences. And let me just give you a quick illustration of that. I'm a Christian. But as well as being a Christian philosopher, my academic expertise is Islam. I'm actually unusual as a Christian in that I have a PhD in Quranic studies. And one of the things that drew me into that fascinated me about studying a faith different to my own, were in fact the differences. And the more I studied Islam, the less similarities I saw. So for example, when you compare the Quran and the Bible and you ask those questions, what is God like? Well, you see a very different view of God in the Bible than you do in the Quran. For example, the God in the Bible is a God who is relational and personal, who can be known personally. The God of the Quran is a God who is distant and transcendent, to use a big word, but quite different view of God. What does it mean to be a human being? Well, the Bible on the very first page says that human beings were made in the image of God. The Bible has a very high view of humanity. The Quran thinks human beings are very important, but doesn't make a claim anything like that. What's gone wrong with the world? The Quran would say what's gone wrong with the world is God has given us a set of commands and he wants us to behave a certain way. We haven't behaved appropriately and that's what's wrong. The Bible would say no, it's something much deeper actually. We are in deep rebellion with God and the relationship with him that we were designed for has been utterly fractured and damaged. And what's the solution? Islam, the Quran would say, well, the solution is obedience. Keep obeying, more commands, work hard enough, you can kind of earn merit and pay back the damage that you've done for disobedience. The Bible would say, actually, the gap between us and God is so great that we can't bridge it on our own. What we need is a rescuer, and that's what Jesus is all about. Now, mention of Jesus is interesting because Jesus said some things on this question of religious diversity. And in particular, Jesus on one occasion said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to God except through me. Now, our reaction to that might be, my word, how outrageously exclusive to say that it's Jesus, to say that it's your way or the highway. But I would say actually what's interesting is exclusivity is baked into all of the world's religious traditions. Islam is an exclusive faith. Muhammad didn't say, hey, here's some ideas, you like them? Fantastic. If you don't, choose something else. He claimed to have the only truth. He claimed that he was the final prophet. He claimed the Quran was God's final revelation. The Buddha, when he was alive, said some incredibly critical things about Hinduism. He criticized other faiths and said they were wrong. And by the way, if you're listening to this thinking, well, this is lovely, I'm an atheist, none of this applies. If you're an atheist, you of course happen to be committed to the idea that every other religious person on the planet is wrong and that your idea that there is no God is the ultimate truth. You can't avoid exclusivity because truth by its very nature is exclusive. 2 plus 2 is 4. It isn't an infinite number of other possibilities. And so I would suggest it is not unusual that when we deal with religion, we are dealing with the question of what is true. So how do we navigate some of this? Well, sometimes truth can take effort to find out. We're going to have to think and read and reflect and study. We might have to perhaps, crack open the Gospels, those 4 historical biographies of Jesus, and read some of the stuff he said and think, is this true? And we can ask the truth question of other religions too. But we can also try and create cultures in our society and also in our workplaces where we encourage people to bring their faith with them into the workplace because it's part of their identity, but also encourage people to talk to one another about these deep questions and not be afraid of difference. Difference is not something to be afraid of, because if we truly respect and value one another, our friends and our colleagues, then we can afford to allow space for disagreement because we can respect one another even while recognizing we have difference. So as we think about these big questions of religion and spirituality, don't be afraid to ask those big questions of life. Make sure that you pursue truth, that you recognize there is truth out there to be found. But as you do that, honor and respect those whose journeys look a bit different to yours, not by shoving everyone together into one great big melting pot, but realizing that we are wired as humans to be spiritual. We are wired to look for God, and that the pursuit of truth is going to require some discussion and even some dispute and disagreement along the way.